We're going to start our look at the ancient Greek world with the earliest period of art referred to as the geometric period. Now, this is coming at the beginnings of this new civilization in the 9th century, and it spans about 100 years. We're going to look at the artwork, and you're going to be surprised at how much has changed. You could say how much was lost or how much was forgotten in terms of technology and visual expression. Things dramatically changed since the Mycenaean world. We're going to turn our attention to the city of Athens. Now, this image is a modern image or a modern day image, so it's kind of misleading. Don't think this is what it looked like, okay? I'm putting you here because I want you to see this outcrop of rock in the center of the city. Athens was an ancient Mycenaean citadel. And the Mycenaean citadel was up here on this rocky outcrop. No surprise, right? We saw that at Tiryns, we saw that at Mycenae. After the fall of the Mycenaeans, this area was, well, lost and forgotten and destroyed, and we start to see the establishment of a new people, the Greeks, around the citadel, and the city of Athens will start to flourish during the geometric period. In case you're wondering where it is, Athens is right there. We were hanging out in Mycenae, and Tiryns is up in this area here. So here's Athens, and the artwork we're going to look at for the geometric period is the geometric crater. It was found at the Dipylon Cemetery in Athens, Greece. All right, so now let's pause. Look, period style, geometric period. So we're calling this, don't call it ancient Greek. That's way too vague of a term. This is the geometric period. The title of this artwork, the geometric crater from the Dipylon Cemetery. This is important because it will help us understand the function of this pot. And here, let me just tell you. So here's a map, very rough map of the early settlement in Athens. We were looking here at that rise of rock where the citadel used to be. This thick line here are the city walls. Now there were a few points of interest that are outlined here, but we're just ignoring those. Instead, I'm circling this gate right here, and there was a cemetery just outside this city gate. The cemetery is called the Dipylon Cemetery or Dipylon Cemetery. And, well, you know how I love to break down words. Di means two in Greek. Pylon are posts. So the Dipylon or the Dipylon Cemetery is the cemetery located outside of the two posts, the gate. So the Dipylon Cemetery is the cemetery just outside the city gates. And it has served us so well in terms of understanding early Greek culture because they bury their dead as ashes, so they don't mummify like we saw in Greece. They burn their dead, they bury them as ashes, and then they identify these burials with art. And that's what this served as, a grave marker. So the geometric crater from the Dipylon Cemetery is a grave marker. It's kind of obvious why it's called a geometric period, right? So looking back at this time, and again, remember, they didn't call themselves geometric people or geometric period. This is art historians looking back, and they were like, you know what? All of this art from this period has lots of geometric shapes. See it? Look. Look at these diamond patterns, these dots, triangles, squares, zigzags, chevrons. The people, the figures here have been reduced to geometric forms. Triangles for their torsos. Look at their fantastic calves, are these half ovals. Below here, we have horses reduced to these geometric lines and shapes, a person on a chariot. So you see why we would call this the geometric period? Look at the elaborate design work of these geometric shapes and patterns. So the geometric crater is typical of the geometric period style. These bands of geometric patterns, and then identifying the person who has been buried beneath this crater are these figures here to help us in identifying who that is. We're going to look at it a little bit closer, but I also want to emphasize the height or the size of this. This stands at 3 feet 4 inches. What? Look at that. What? That's my former student Amanda, and she went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, where it is located, and she took a selfie with it. And it's huge, right? Oh my gosh. So this massive crater was set on top of the burial site of a man, a very important man who served in the military. How do we know all of this? Because of what has been painted on this crater. Do you remember we talked about the vocab word crater? Crater means a wide-mouthed pot, typically for mixing wine and water. This crater wouldn't have been placed in the middle of a banquet. Instead, this crater would have been a place where we could make offerings of wine and water and give it to the person buried beneath. I wish I had a picture of the inside of it, but there is a hole at the bottom of this right here. And that hole would serve 2 functions. It would serve, well, drainage, because when it rains, it's got to go somewhere. And also, when you pour the wine and that water into this crater, it's an offering, and it goes directly down into the ground to this person. Okay, who is this guy? Let's zoom in. Here he is. He's laid out on a funeral pyre. A pyre is like a table where you lay out the dead for those to come and worship or give thanks or mourn. So we see the man, and he's laid out here. And then on either side, we see his family. We see one figure here. We see some smaller figures. Look at that. Now, remember, smaller doesn't mean that they're these tiny itty-bitty fairy creatures. Hierarchic scale. He's the biggest one here because he's the most important. And then those figures around him are his family members, and they're indicating their stature or status. We believe that this checkerboard pattern around him is to symbolize the textile, the fabric that would have been laid over his body. So you can see it's been lifted here. Perhaps those dots are like little tassels. So the fabric's been lifted up to show us the body on the funeral pyre. He's got 2 faithful dogs, 2 faithful companions underneath him. On either side, we see these figures who, geometric period, they're reduced to triangles. Their arms are these rectangle shapes, and they're reaching up to their heads because you know what they're doing? They're tearing out their hair. What? What? Yes, it was common in the ancient Greek world to hire mourners to come to a funeral. These mourners were professionals who would beat their chest and wail and cry and tear out their hair. it might sound like ridiculous to hire people to mourn for you, but this made perfect sense because this was an indication of your status and your power because so many people were upset with your passing. It was a way to tell the gods, indicate to them how much you will be missed, how great and honorable you were. The worst thing that you could do if somebody was to die, when somebody died, was to not mourn, to not cry, because that implied that they were not important. They had no significance. So here, this man is flanked on either side by lots of mourners. He must have been extremely powerful, great importance. Beneath, we have an indication of his status in the military. What? Yeah, I told you these are guys on chariots, and this man here is holding a shield and his spears. Shield and spears. So we have a military procession for this man. So he served in the military. Maybe he was still a military leader when he died. The chariots are going around this vase pulled by, look at these horses. Aren't they fantastic? There's 3 horses there. And they've been reduced to this odd shape, but there are 3 heads and there are enough feet for 3 horses. Look at that. Isn't that great? So we see these figures marching around, indicating his participation in the military, and that he must have been some great leader or person in the community to have so many people mourning his loss. The decoration on the top. The decoration on the top is called a meander. And you see this a lot, this motif, a lot in Greek art. So you see it there? The meander. Meander is the meander can come in various forms, but it's always going to be a mix of horizontal and vertical lines, and how they fold in on each other can be changed. So anytime you see Greek art, you might often see this type of a pattern, and you can now say, oh, that's a meander pattern. And then you can sound even smarter by saying where the meander came from. We call it the meander because it is in reference to the Meander River, which is a river that runs through the Anatolian Peninsula. And it's a river that's known for these switchbacks, this constant kind of go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so that switchback is then translated into this design pattern. Isn't that fun? I know, right? While we only look at the geometric crater in this class, there are other pots from the Dipolon Cemetery and in that geometric period. Here we are looking at one of my favorites. This is the geometric amphora. It's also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I like this image here to help you understand how big it is. Now, an amphora is simply another shape of pottery, and this is an amphora shape. This too was used as a grave marker. You see the similarity? We have our mourners, we have the body on the pyre, we have that checkerboard we believe to be the fabric that would have been on top of the body. And then, oh, look at the beautiful geometric patterns. Look at all the meanders. Look at these long lines of shape. Oh, just mesmerizing, isn't it? So here is another geometric period artwork, and it was also located at the Dipolon Cemetery and was also used, like the geometric crater, as a way to not only mark where the dead was buried, but then to offer libations of wine and water to the dead. We'll see this practice of offering some kind of precious liquid continue throughout the ancient Greek world. I mean, it's not a far stretch from what we do today, right? I mean, think about it. Like, you pour one out for your homies, right? You drink one and you pour on the ground for your dead, fallen comrades. It's the same concept. We do this all the time. So here, this crater is that bowl of wine and water. You're offering it to the dead who are buried beneath this spot. We think we're so clever, and yet we've been doing this forever.